They dragged a black woman out of a mall in handcuffs, humiliated her in front of hundreds of strangers, but what the crowd didn't know was that she was actually a police captain, and the moment she spoke, everything changed. The skylights of Greenwood Mall spilled sunlight like liquid gold across polished tiles, catching on glass storefronts and bright banners. Families pushed strollers, teenagers laughed near the fountain, and vendors called out soft greetings from their kiosks. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when life felt ordinary and safe. Captain Denise Carter, off-duty and dressed simply in jeans and a soft blue sweater, allowed herself the rare pleasure of being just another shopper. Her niece's birthday was coming up, and Denise had promised herself she would find something special. She moved with purpose but with ease, her leather purse swinging at her side, the weight of responsibility lifted for a few precious hours. For the first time all week, she was not a captain wrangling reports or mediating precinct politics. She was an aunt, thinking only about what might bring a smile to Jasmine's face. She paused in front of a boutique window where delicate bracelets gleamed under spotlights. A breath escaped her lips, a whisper of calm, but then she caught it, the reflection of a man standing too still in the corner of the glass. His uniform was pressed, his belt heavy with a radio. The name tag read Miller. His eyes were locked on her, unblinking. He spoke softly into his radio, lips moving with a report she could almost recite herself. Denise shifted her weight, her jaw tightening. 20 years in law enforcement had taught her to read a tale long before it pounced. She moved on, but another figure slid into view, shorter, shoulders hunched, holding a folded map in his hands like a stage prop. Davis. He kept pretending to study the directory, yet every few seconds his eyes flicked up toward her purse, then quickly away, as if afraid to be caught in the act. Denise's pulse quickened though she kept her face composed. She had seen this choreography too many times before. Two shadows circling, making the ordinary act of shopping feel like the first step in a trap. She turned back to the boutique display. Inside, a young sales clerk leaned toward her colleague, eyes darting toward Denise's brown leather purse. Their voices were low, but their expressions told the story. A whisper, a knowing look, a slight shake of the head. Denise caught the movement in the reflection of the glass and felt the familiar sting in her chest. It was always the same, her skin, her presence, her quiet composure read as suspicion before she had touched a single item. She took a breath, steadying herself. Not today, she thought. Not when this was supposed to be about Jasmine's birthday and nothing else. She stepped into the boutique, the air perfumed with vanilla, soft jazz curling through the speakers. On the surface it was inviting, but the shift in body language was immediate. The clerk stiffened, eyes narrowing for a split second before smoothing into a professional smile. Denise felt it like static in the air. The mall was a place of glass and light, yet for her the shadows arrived quickly, carried by stares and whispered words. She told herself she would ignore it, that she would not let them ruin the afternoon. But already, the warmth she had felt walking in had thinned into something sharper. Every detail, the radio at Miller's side, Davis's restless glances, the clerk's whisper toward her purse, layered together like bars of a cage sliding quietly into place. Denise touched the window case, letting her eyes rest on the silver butterfly bracelet she knew her niece would love. Her lips formed a small smile, fragile and private. But even that simple gesture felt stolen by the weight of eyes pressing in from every direction. She knew the feeling too well. Suspicion not born from action, but assumption. She was a black woman carrying a purse in an upscale store. That was enough to set the wheels in motion. And somewhere, deep in her gut, Denise sensed that what was happening around her was no coincidence. It was too neat, too deliberate. A game was being played, and she had just walked into it. The sunlight outside still poured bright and golden across the mall, but inside her chest a storm was gathering. What should have been a quiet Saturday was already shifting into something else. Something that would test not only her patience, but the very badge she had dedicated her life to. The boutique welcomed her with a manufactured elegance, every detail calculated to impress. Bright white lights poured from the ceiling, reflecting off glass counters filled with delicate jewelry, while slow jazz hummed through hidden speakers. The air was thick with the sweet scent of vanilla and rose, a fragrance designed to signal luxury, to make customers feel like they were stepping into a world just out of reach. Denise let herself focus on the display case in front of her, where a silver bracelet shimmered under the lights. It was the butterfly charm that caught her eye, its wings tipped with tiny crystals that sparkled as though they had been waiting for this moment. She pictured Jasmine's face lighting up when she unwrapped it, her smile wide and unguarded, and for a moment the noise outside faded. The weight of eyes returned quickly. A shadow fell across the case, and Denise looked up into the face of a woman with sharp features, her blazer perfectly pressed. The name tag read Linda. Her smile was professional but cold, and her eyes didn't linger on the bracelet Denise had been admiring. Instead, they slid deliberately to the purse hanging from Denise's shoulder. "We have to be careful here," Linda said, her voice sweetened just enough to sound polite while cutting all the same. "Some of these items are very easy to lose." The words floated in the air, casual on the surface, heavy with implication beneath. Denise's jaw tightened, though her voice stayed even. "I understand. I'd like to see that butterfly bracelet, please." Linda hesitated just a beat too long, then reached for the keys at her belt. Outside the glass entrance, Miller lingered, pretending to study the mall directory while his radio crackled faintly. Denise didn't need to hear the words to know what he was saying. A description of her clothes. The color of her bag. Her movements documented as if she were already a suspect. Davis shifted nervously at his side, stealing glances into the boutique, his unease visible even through the glass. Shoppers drifted in and out of the store, their eyes flicking curiously toward Denise and the security guards outside. A couple near the door slowed their pace, sensing tension they couldn't name. The boutique's hush deepened as though the walls themselves knew a confrontation was taking shape. Linda unlocked the case with hands that trembled ever so slightly, then slid the tray forward. The butterfly charm glittered with fragile beauty. Denise reached out gently, careful, deliberate, the way she had handled evidence for years. But Linda didn't step back. She hovered close, her gaze darting once more to the purse at Denise's side, the suspicion radiating off her in waves. Denise exhaled slowly, her control absolute. She would not give them the scene they wanted. "I'll take this one," she said, her tone calm. Linda's smile faltered, replaced by a sharpness that drew the attention of others in the store. A teenage girl near the earrings rack froze mid-step. A mother holding her child turned to look. The crowd wasn't a crowd yet, just a scattering of eyes, but Denise felt their weight pressing in. "Before we do that," Linda said louder now, her voice projecting across the boutique, "I'll need you to open your bag." The music seemed to falter, the saxophone notes dropping into silence. Heads turned, the quiet chatter of shoppers stilled. Denise's chest tightened, the humiliation rushing in hot. She kept her voice steady, though the sting of anger burned under every syllable. "Excuse me." Linda straightened her shoulders, emboldened by the attention. "We've had problems before. I saw you linger at the case. For everyone's peace of mind, please show us the contents of your purse." Miller's voice crackled again outside the store. Black female. Blue sweater. Brown leather bag. Requesting confirmation. The words carried faintly through the boutique, enough for those nearby to understand. Denise clenched her fists at her sides, not from fear but from fury. She glanced around, seeing the shifting expressions on strangers' faces. Some were skeptical, others curious, a few openly judgmental. It was happening again, the familiar script of suspicion written on her skin before she had spoken a word. She stood taller, her voice clear. "I have touched nothing but the bracelet you unlocked. There is no reason to ask me that." But Linda didn't waver. Her chin lifted, her tone sharper. "Then you won't mind proving it." The word struck like a gavel. The eyes of the boutique locked on Denise, and in that instant, the private humiliation became a public trial. The boutique had turned into a stage, every shopper now an unwilling audience. Denise stood tall at the glass case, the silver bracelet still glinting between her and Linda, but the focus was no longer on jewelry. Miller moved inside, his bulk filling the doorway as Davis slid to one side, his eyes darting nervously from Denise to the growing cluster of bystanders. The once soft hum of jazz now felt thin, swallowed by the rising tension in the air. Denise spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the room. "If you believe something is missing, then let's check your cameras. They're mounted in every corner. The footage will prove I haven't touched a single item." She gestured calmly toward the black dome above, the logic undeniable. For a flicker of a second, Linda's eyes betrayed doubt, her lips parting as though to consider. Then Miller stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Empty the bag. Now." Denise locked eyes with him, refusing to flinch. "I will not. There is no probable cause. You have no right to search my personal belongings without evidence." The firmness of her tone sent ripples through the small crowd, people shifting uncomfortably, some raising phones higher to capture it all. A young man whispered to his friend, "She's right, they can't just search her." But Miller didn't hear or didn't care. He advanced another step, his frame towering, his hand hovering near his radio. Davis hovered behind him, hesitant, chewing at the inside of his cheek. Linda's face had flushed crimson, her voice rising to mask her uncertainty. "A piece of jewelry is missing from this case. I saw you slip something into your purse." Gasps whispered through the boutique. Denise felt the heat crawl up her neck, but her tone remained steady, controlled with the discipline of years in uniform. "That is a lie. I have touched nothing but what you placed in front of me. This is harassment, plain and simple." The word hung heavy. Harassment. A woman near the door nodded quietly, her phone angled to record. Another shopper whispered, "She's standing her ground." Miller's jaw flexed, and he leaned forward, his bulk a wall meant to crush resistance. "Last chance. Open it, or things get complicated." Denise took a deliberate step back, lifting her chin, her voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You want the truth? Review your cameras. The footage is there. Stop targeting me because of the color of my skin." For a moment, silence. Then Miller's radio crackled. "Code 10 at Crystal's boutique. Subject refusing to comply. Requesting backup." That was when the atmosphere shifted. What had been suspicion now escalated into spectacle. Shoppers pressed closer to the glass storefront, phones lit like fireflies, recording every second. Some looked disgusted, others fascinated, but all were drawn in. The boutique, once just a store, had become a courtroom, and Denise was the defendant. Then the crowd parted as another figure strode in. Broad-shouldered, his badge gleaming, a grin that looked more like anticipation than concern. Officer James Raines. His reputation preceded him, even before he spoke. Denise recognized the swagger, the arrogance. Complaints about him had crossed her desk too many times, excessive force, intimidation, always brushed aside by connections higher up. Raines planted himself in the center, voice booming for effect. "What's the situation here?" Linda rushed to explain, eager for backup. "She won't let us search her bag. I saw her put something in it. She's causing trouble." Raines cut her off with a raised hand, his eyes locking on Denise. "Always the same story, isn't it?" His tone dripped with condescension. Denise straightened her shoulders, her training and dignity anchoring her against the humiliation. "This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved by..." The rest of her words were cut short as Raines grabbed her shoulder and slammed her against the glass wall. The sharp crack reverberated through the boutique, the displays rattling violently. Gasps burst from the crowd, the collective shock palpable. The glass chilled her cheek as his weight pressed harder, his voice hissing near her ear. "Don't tell me how to do my job. Hands behind your back." Pain shot through her arms as he yanked them backward, the cold bite of steel closing around her wrists with unnecessary force. Denise's voice carried, not a scream, but firm, measured. This is excessive force. I have rights, and you are violating them. Rains laughed, the sound jagged, performative. You've got the right to stay quiet while I add resisting arrest to your charges. Phones were everywhere now, angles shifting to capture her face pressed to the glass, the cuffs digging into her skin. Whispered outrage rippled through the boutique. This isn't right. She didn't do anything. But no one stepped forward. Rains pulled her away from the display, parading her toward the exit as if she were a trophy. Denise forced her head high, even as humiliation clawed at her, her body aching from the rough treatment. Outside the boutique, the mall's main corridor had frozen into silence, shoppers pressed to the sides, phones raised high like witnesses in a trial. The truth was out there, but in that moment, the lie was stronger. What had started as whispers of suspicion had exploded into an arrest. Denise felt the full weight of injustice pressing down, every second branding itself into the memory of those watching. The story was no longer private humiliation. It was public spectacle. And the trap had sprung shut. The sunlight outside was merciless, a glare that made the asphalt shimmer and the crowd squint as they poured out of the mall doors behind her. Rains gripped Denise's arm like a trophy he was determined to display, his pace forceful, his chest puffed for the audience of strangers. Each tug sent pain radiating through her shoulders, but Denise refused to let him bow her head. She walked upright, chin lifted, eyes steady, every step a deliberate act of defiance. Phones rose higher, their lenses catching every angle, voices in the crowd breaking the silence. She didn't do anything, someone shouted. Another voice called, "Let her go." Rains ignored them, his smug grin plastered across his face, his badge catching the sunlight as if it gave him immunity. The patrol car gleamed in the distance, waiting like a steel cage. Denise's breath came sharp, but her voice when it broke through was measured, strong. "Before you put me in that car, Officer Rains, there's something this crowd should know." Rains sneered, tugging harder. "Save it for booking." The words were meant to silence, but Denise's voice rose, carrying over the restless murmur of the crowd. "I am Captain Denise Carter. 15th Precinct. My badge is in my pocket. Left side." A beat of stunned silence swept through the onlookers, then gasps, murmurs, shouts. The chant of phones clicking grew louder, people pushing closer, determined to capture the moment. Rains froze mid-step, his hand still on the car door, his swagger faltering. "That's cute," he said too quickly, his bravado cracking. "Everybody claims something." But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with uncertainty as the crowd surged. A teenager's voice rang clear, "She's a captain. You just arrested a captain." The words ignited the assembly like sparks hitting dry tinder. More voices piled in, "Check her badge." "What are you doing? She outranks you." Rain's hand twitched, caught between doubling down and letting go. He reached roughly into her pocket, expecting a bluff, but the weight of the badge stopped him cold. He pulled it free, and the gold shield glittered in the blazing sun. The crowd erupted, cheers mixing with angry cries. "She's a captain. You arrested your own boss." Rain's face flushed red, his authority unraveling in his hands. This could be fake, he snapped, his voice rising, but the tone no longer carried confidence. Phones zoomed closer, capturing his shake, the tremor in his grip. Then another voice cut through the chaos, deep and steady. "It's real." Sergeant Robert Watkins stepped into the circle, his uniform sun-worn, his face calm but commanding. He had worked with Denise for years, knew her reputation, her integrity, her authority. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on Rains. "That's Captain Carter. Your commanding officer's commanding officer." His words landed like a hammer blow. The crowd roared again, some cheering, some jeering, all of them united in their outrage. Rain's mouth opened, then closed, his face a shifting storm of panic and fury. He tried to speak, but the sound drowned in the chant that rose from the crowd, "Let her go. Let her go." Denise stood still, her wrists raw from the cuffs, her eyes locked on Rain's crumbling mask. Every fiber of her being burned with humiliation and rage, but in that instant she also felt the tide shift. The trap he had set for her had been flipped in full view of the public. For the first time since he shoved her against the boutique glass, she allowed herself a small, controlled smile. The sun beat down, the air buzzed with voices and cameras, and the truth stood undeniable. She was not a nameless suspect. She was Captain Denise Carter, and the whole world had just seen the system try, and fail, to erase her. The quiet of Denise's house felt heavy that night, the kind of silence that pressed against the walls and filled the spaces between breaths. A single lamp cast a warm circle of light across her desk, the rest of the room fading into shadow. The glow of her laptop screen flickered across her face, highlighting the hard lines of exhaustion that had deepened since the mall incident. She opened her email, her stomach tightening at the subject line, Incident Report 2T123487. Her name. Her reputation. Her entire career reduced to words on a screen. She clicked, and the document unfolded like a trap. According to Officer Rains, she had been combative from the moment security approached. The report claimed she struck out at officers, that she resisted lawful orders, that she created a disturbance threatening public safety. Every line painted her not as the woman the crowd had seen dragged out in cuffs, but as the stereotype she had fought her entire career to dismantle, an angry black woman, out of control. Denise's jaw locked, her hands trembling on the keys. She read the words again, each one more poisonous than the last. It wasn't just a lie. It was a blueprint designed to erase the truth of what happened, to overwrite the videos, the witnesses, the badge in her pocket. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Carla Johnson's name lit the screen. Denise answered, her voice sharper than she intended. "He filed it already." Carla's sigh was weary, but not surprised. "I figured he would. Forward it to me." Denise clicked send, her voice breaking with disbelief. "He says I assaulted him. That I resisted arrest." Carla's voice hardened, the lawyer in her rising to the surface. "That's the playbook. I've seen it too many times. You know how this works, Denise. First version on paper becomes the official narrative. The videos get questioned, the crowd dismissed as biased. But the report? That sticks." Denise pushed back from the desk, pacing across the small pool of light, her hands clenching and unclenching. 20 years. 20 years of service, spotless record, and they reduce me to this. A criminal in my own department's eyes. Carla didn't argue. She let the silence hang heavy before she spoke again, her tone gentler. "I've defended half a dozen cases this year with the exact same pattern. All black, all accused of resisting, all backed by reports like this one. And do you know what happens? Most of them plead out because they're scared. They pay fines, they accept probation, they disappear into the system." Denise stopped, her breath caught. Probation. Carla shuffled papers on her end of the line. Exactly. Probation handed out like candy, and always through the same private contractor. New Horizon Supervision Services. They charge people hundreds a month just to breathe free air. Miss a payment, you're back in jail. Denise's chest tightened, the pieces clicking into place. So it's not just harassment. It's profit. Carla's voice was grim. Follow the money, and you'll see. These arrests aren't accidents. They're a business model. Denise sank back into her chair, the light from her laptop blurring through the sting in her eyes. She thought of the bruises still blooming on her wrists, the weight of the cuffs that should never have touched her. She thought of the young man in the boutique whispering that she was right, the woman at the mall doors shouting for her release. Their voices were proof, but this report threatened to bury all of it under official ink. Her voice was a whisper, cracked and low. I believed in this system. I told myself change was possible from the inside. And now the inside is what's tearing me apart. Carla didn't offer false comfort. She let Denise's words settle before answering. You're not alone in this. We can fight. But you have to understand, this isn't about one bad cop. It's a machine. And they've already decided you're the wrench in their gears. Denise leaned forward, her elbows on the desk, her face in her hands. The gold badge lay beside her laptop, catching the lamplight, a cruel reminder of everything she had stood for. She whispered to herself more than to Carla. 20 years, and they've made me the enemy. The silence after that felt endless. And yet beneath the despair, beneath the anger, a colder truth took root. If this was bigger than her, then her fight could no longer be about clearing her name alone. It had to be about pulling back the curtain on the whole network that thrived on lies, arrests, and profit. The system had struck back. But in its arrogance, it had revealed the depth of its rot. The office was small, tucked above a laundromat on the edge of the city, its walls lined with stacks of old newspapers and file boxes. The glow of a single desk lamp cast long shadows across the clutter. Maya Lopez leaned forward, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She was young but carried herself with the weight of someone who had spent too long digging where no one wanted her to. Denise sat across from her, the wood of the chair creaking under her as she laid out what she had found. Arrest reports. Patterns of false charges. Names that kept repeating. Raines. Martinez. Greenwood Mall. Maya tapped the papers with a pen, her voice steady. This lines up with what I've been chasing. Money trails, shell companies, payments funneled through probation contracts. But I couldn't connect the dots inside the department. You just gave me the missing piece. Denise studied her, seeing in the young journalist the same fire she had carried 2 decades ago. If you publish, they'll come after you. Maya's mouth curved into a grim smile. They already have. I'm still here. The room went quiet, the weight of the fight between them settling like smoke. Later that evening, they drove together to the community center where Reverend Marcus Green waited. The building smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the kind of place patched together by volunteers who refused to give up. Inside, a small group had gathered, teachers, shop owners, parents. Each carried stories and scars. Reverend Green spread photographs across the table, his voice resonant. These are from the last 3 months. Bruises. Arrest records. Complaints buried before they saw daylight. A barber spoke next, his hands trembling as he pushed forward sworn statements. Raines shakes people down. Always the same charges. Resisting. Disorderly conduct. If you speak up, he finds you again. A teacher named Lisa placed medical reports in front of Denise, her eyes hard. This woman was tackled in front of her children. She tried to file a complaint. 2 weeks later she was arrested again. Probation fees forced her into a second job. The evidence piled higher, the weight of it filling the room. Denise's chest tightened as she listened. The scale of it was staggering. It wasn't just her humiliation at the mall. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, lives bent under the same machine. Maya scribbled notes furiously, her determination blazing brighter with every word. Denise spoke finally, her voice quiet but firm. This isn't law enforcement. It's exploitation. And it has to end. Heads nodded around the table. For the first time in days, Denise felt something shift inside her. She was not alone. They left late, the night air heavy with resolve. Maya promised to draft an outline for her story, to start preparing the documents for publication. Denise drove home, exhaustion pressing into her bones, but a fragile thread of hope had taken root. She parked under the dim glow of her porch light and gathered the day's mail. At first glance it was ordinary, bills and flyers, but tucked between them were envelopes with no return address. Inside, her stomach dropped. A crude drawing of a body hanging from a noose. The words cut from magazines, "Mind your business." Another envelope held photographs, surveillance shots of her walking to her car, leaving the precinct, meeting Carla at dinner. Someone was following her. More letters spilled out onto the table inside her kitchen. Racial slurs scrawled in jagged handwriting. Threats against her family. The final envelope stopped her cold. A photo of herself being handcuffed at the mall, a black crosshair drawn over her face. Denise sat heavily, her fingers trembling as she spread them across the table. The threats were no longer subtle. They were direct, intimate, designed to break her will. Fear coiled in her chest, real and sharp. Yet beneath it, anger burned hotter. She gathered the letters carefully, sliding them into a folder for evidence. Her police instincts catalogued every detail, the handwriting, the timing, the lack of postmarks. Someone local. Someone close. Her phone buzzed suddenly. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. On the other end, silence. Then a man's voice, low and deliberate. You don't know who you're dealing with. Stop before it's too late. The line went dead. Denise stared at the dark screen, her reflection looking back at her, the weight of the day pressing down. She thought of Maya, of Reverend Green, of the faces around the table who had put their trust in her. Fear was real, yes, but so was the responsibility. She whispered to herself, steady and unyielding. If they're this scared, it means we're close. Hours later, the phone rang again. This time it was Carla, her voice urgent. Denise. It's Maya. She was attacked outside her office. She's in the hospital. The words punched through her like ice. Denise gripped the phone tighter, her free hand curling into a fist. They had escalated. The threats were no longer words on paper. They had crossed into blood and bone. She closed her eyes, forcing her breath steady. The truth had always been dangerous. But now it was lethal. And that meant she was closer than ever to tearing the whole machine apart. The marble hall of city council pulsed with noise, cameras clicking, reporters jostling for position, the chamber packed so tightly that people stood along the walls and spilled into the hallway. Every eye was waiting, every phone already live. Denise stood near the back, her folder heavy in her hands, the weight of weeks of humiliation and sleepless nights pressed into the papers inside. On the dais, council members shifted uneasily. The mayor dabbed sweat from his forehead, his gaze darting between his phone and the restless crowd. Near the front row, Officer Raines lounged in his seat, smirking as though the chamber itself belonged to him. At his side sat Charles Wilson, the mall's CEO, whispering with smug confidence. Denise's pulse hammered as her phone buzzed. A notification lit the screen. The unedited video had just gone live. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder as people tapped their screens, showing one another the footage. The image of Raines whispering to Linda before Denise even entered the boutique spread across the chamber like wildfire. His smirk faltered, his head snapping toward the crowd as the whispers rose into outrage. The mayor cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. Next speaker. The words carried no weight. The room's attention had already shifted. Denise stepped forward, each stride measured, her heart pounding but her voice calm as she spoke into the mic. My name is Captain Denise Carter. 15th Precinct. 2 weeks ago I was arrested in Greenwood Mall, accused of shoplifting while buying my niece a gift. Many of you have seen the video. But that was only the beginning. She laid the folder open on the podium, pages spilling across the wood. This isn't just about one false arrest. It is about a machine built on harassment, on intimidation, on profit. Here are internal communications between mall executives and police officers, discussing arrest quotas targeting black citizens. Here are bank records showing payments from the mall's parent company into a probation contractor they secretly own. Every false arrest becomes a paycheck. The chamber erupted with noise. Reporters surged forward, flashes turning the air into strobe. People shouted from the gallery. "She's right. We knew it." Denise raised her voice, cutting through. "This system has destroyed lives. Mothers forced to choose between feeding their children and paying probation fees. Young men branded criminals for walking in the wrong place. A community bled dry while those sworn to protect them lined their pockets." She turned, her eyes locking on Rains. "And the same officer who threw me against a wall filed a false report claiming I assaulted him. That officer sits here tonight." Rains shot to his feet, rage twisting his face. "Lies," he roared, pushing toward the podium, hand lifting as if to silence her himself. But before he could reach her, two uniformed officers stepped into his path. "Stand down, Rains," one said firmly. The second added, "You're not in charge here." Rains shoved at them, but more officers rose from the crowd, forming a wall between him and Denise. Phones captured every second, the chaos streaming live. The chant began in the back row, first a few voices, then dozens, then hundreds. "Justice! Justice!" The word rolled over the chamber like thunder. Rains froze, his swagger dissolving as the crowd roared. Then another voice cut through the din, steady and authoritative. "Captain Carter." State Attorney Patricia Walsh stepped forward from the back of the chamber, flanked by investigators in dark suits. Her eyes scanned the documents on the podium, widening as she flipped through the pages. "This is comprehensive. Payments, emails, sworn statements. It is more than enough." She looked up sharply. "Nobody leaves this room. Officer Rains, Charles Wilson, you are both under arrest." The chamber exploded into shouts as investigators moved quickly. Wilson tried to slip toward the exit, but a pair of agents intercepted him, cuffs clicking around his wrists. Rains thrashed, shouting curses, but the line of officers who once feared him now closed in, their grips firm as they forced his hands behind his back. The cameras captured his downfall in brutal clarity. Denise stood still at the podium, her breath shaking but her gaze unbroken. The chant outside the chamber grew louder, echoing through the windows as more protesters realized what was happening inside. Justice had finally broken through the walls that had held it back for so long. 3 days later, Greenwood Mall was almost unrecognizable. Yellow tape sealed off shuttered storefronts, investigators combed through offices, and the air of polished prosperity had cracked into something fragile and hollow. Denise walked through the main corridor, this time in uniform, her captain's badge gleaming proudly on her chest. Shoppers paused, some clapping softly, others whispering her name with gratitude. Near the boutique where it had all begun, her niece Jasmine rushed into her arms, eyes bright. "Auntie D, it's different now. They know who you are." Denise smiled, placing a silver necklace around the girl's neck, its pendant catching the light. Around them, strangers nodded, saluted, some even wept quietly. The humiliation of that day was still etched in memory, but now it had been rewritten. The same space that had tried to strip her dignity had become the ground where justice stood. And in that moment, Denise Carter knew the fight was far from over, but the tide had turned. For herself. For her community. For everyone who refused to be silenced.